Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our next installment of the Social Justice and College Athletics Series. Happy holidays from snowy Cleveland, and we have 818 attendees with us today, so it's going to be a great session. And I hope throughout this year you've been keeping yourself safe, and we're looking forward to this being our final NACDA virtual programming for the year. We've provided in excess of 200 hours this year, and we're looking forward to continuing that very, very successful programming into 2021. We're excited to bring you today's discussion on a topic that many of us may unknowingly engage in from time to time. A microaggression is defined as a statement, action, or incident regarded as an instance of indirect, subtle, or intentional discrimination against members of a marginalized group, such as a racial or ethnic minority. This afternoon's session, titled Microaggressions, we do it, but it doesn't mean that it's right, will facilitate a necessary conversation so that we can learn how to recognize and limit these types of references in our dialogues in the future. This afternoon, through the help of NACDA Social Justice and College Athletics Task Force member and MOA President, Jude, we're pleased to welcome an engaging panel of colleagues to share their experiences with these references and how they are attempting to educate their staff and student athletes to reshape the conversation. China will moderate today's session with Bryan Blair, Deputy Director of Athletics and Chief Operating Officer at Washington State University, Vicky Chun, Director of Athletics at Yale University, Irma Garcia, Director of Athletics at St. Francis, Brooklyn, and Jill Karlgaard, Director of Athletics, Recreation and Lifetime Fitness at Rice University. Panelists, thank you all for being with us today. Before we begin, I'd like to remind all the attendees that this is an interactive session. So at the bottom of your screen, hit the Q&A button if you desire to ask a question, and we'll make certain to get as many of these questions in as possible, because again, it is important that we have a dialogue on such an intriguing topic as this. Well, that's all I have for now. China, I will turn it over to you, and looking forward to a great session. Thank you all again.
Thanks, Bob. I greatly appreciate your leadership in creating a platform for industry leaders to have these type of conversations. And thanks, Katie. And she does have a new name now. So if you do see Hen, is that correct, Katie? H-E-I-N. That's her new name. And so I appreciate her for overseeing the technical logistics of this session. And then, of course, Pat Panic for listening and supporting our brainstorming sessions. And always, I want to shout out to my Social Justice Committee colleagues, Lee Reed from Georgetown, Ward Manuel from Michigan, and Alan Green from Auburn University for their continued engagement and support so we can create good content for you. Okay, so today I'm going to put a blanket citation on the topic of microaggressions. You know, years back, I had the opportunity to listen to Dr. Daryl Wing, who speaks about this particular topic. Actually, Daryl Wing Sue. That's his name, Daryl Wing Sue. And actually, Dr. Sue is a professor of counseling psychology at Columbia University, and I view him as the godfather of microaggressions. I've listened to many of his presentations and saw him live, and I just really was obsessed by this topic. And so not only Dr. Sue co-founded the Asian American Psychological Association with his brother Stanley Sue, he is published over 150 publications in this particular field of culture, race, microaggressions. So many of these terms and the definitions that I'm going to use is based upon the readings of Dr. Sue. So without further ado, let's dive deep into microaggressions. So welcome to the panelists. I'm so glad we have the opportunity to learn about each of you, not what's on the resume or even in the work environment setting that we probably don't see on a regular basis, but this does give you the opportunity to candidly speak about microaggressions. So, as Dave Chappelle would say, we're going to keep it real. So, Vicky, let's go ahead and kick it off with you. I'm going to jump in with you first because I did mention Dr. Sue, and he's at Columbia, and I know that he's your Ivy League colleague on the other side. But I recently saw on Twitter that Arizona State University had its first Chinese born player scored a touchdown in an FBS game. And it was just kind of mind blowing. It didn't register with me in seeing that history being made. So, can you speak on maybe some of those microaggressions in regards to Asian Americans in this particular space, which is pretty surprising when you think of um, uh, Apollo Ono and Jeremy Lin and just so many great athletes in the Asian American community. Speak about some of those experiences that you have.
Sure. Well, I mean, I want to thank Jeremy Lin because I've been in athletics all my life. And I talked to my parents, and for the first time, they're like, Vicky, we'll call you back. We're watching a basketball game. And I'm like, a basketball game? Do you even know what that is? And they're like, oh, yes, we're going to watch Jeremy. And they're like, this must be similar to what you do for a living. And I said, yes, thank you. And thank you, Jeremy. But, it's something where microaggressions, I think everyone, I know that we experience, and it's something that's in our daily lives. And even when I read that story, I was looking for his Chinese name because he was born in China, and they kept referring to him as Jackson. And it took me a while to find it. And it's hey pi zing. And so it's interesting because I read all those articles and it didn't have that. And then if you read into it, he created the Jackson name, and where you still have to kind of change your name when you come to America. And really with microaggressions, and I talked to this with Bryan, and I'm sure Irma, like the things that I tend to hear all the time, is where are you from? And I'll say California, and they're like, no, where are you from? And I'm like, California. Or they'll say, I had this one, you look Eskimo. I said, well, I'm Chinese. And they're like, no, I really think, and it's like having these conversations again and again. And do I know Chinese cooking? It is just, one time my mom and I got into the state fair for free because it was Native American Day. And I just said, Mom, let's just go. But these are just things that are part of our daily lives that when we look at articles and things, you have a certain take on it. And so that's kind of just, reading that article is incredible because of, I can't believe that's the first time, but also how are we reading it?
Yeah, we're reading it definitely in different spaces, in different ways. I'm sure that it'll probably resonate with you more than it would resonate with someone else, especially when it's the first. And it's unfortunately here we are in 2020, soon to be 2021, and we're still talking about the first. That's pretty scary, but I'm hoping we're going to continue to grow and see some great athletes in all of these ethnic groups, because it really does make a difference and bring a different look all across the board. Bryan, you wrote an article, and Bryan's on my MOA board, so I have not really had the chance to dig deep into this, but it was so great to read this article that you wrote in Front Office Sports titled College Athletics, Where Do We Go From Here? And in the article, you wrote about walking into a meeting with a colleague. Can you speak about that particular experience as well as any other experience in regards to microaggression?
Absolutely. And first of all, appreciate you, China, for bringing this great group together, tackling a tough subject. I mean, this is uncomfortable. You talked about keeping it real. Microaggressions are hard to talk about. I think it's easy to talk about things that people consider racist, and they envision Klan hoods or fire hoses or civil rights movement. Those are kind of clear examples. When you talk about microaggressions and things that people do unintentionally, I mean, it's just not black and white. Microaggressions are not black and white. It's mixed with gray. It's a lot of understanding how other people live in their life. So it's hard to sometimes wrap people's mind around. And so what prompted that article was really me. We had the murder of George Floyd, and then you had these other episodes throughout our country. And I had a lot of people reaching out to me to ask me, okay, how do you feel? What has your experience been? Those kind of things. And I think after a while, it kind of dawned on me that there was an assumption sometimes that maybe because you have a certain education level or you work at a certain title or whatever have you, that you don't experience some of these same kind of things as maybe the people that look like you that I see on TV or read about in the news and some of those type of things. So my experience, I mean, is I don't feel any different than a lot of other Black male experiences in the United States. But one of the things that I noticed when I got into the industry, I'd walk into the room with colleagues, and this has been throughout my entire career, whether it be at South Carolina, whether it be with Joe at Rice or here at Washington State and Pullman, all across the country. What would happen was I'd walk into the room with a white colleague, usually a white male, given where I worked. And it was always assumed that I worked for that person, no matter if that person was my coworker, no matter if I hired that person, no matter if we worked in two completely different departments. It was always assumed that you're the person that set up the meeting. I'm going to talk to you about the decision. And the eye contact would never be directed towards me until the second or third iteration of, no, I would defer to Bryan on that decision. And that's something that I've encountered. And it's almost one of those things you normalize. I often get the question, hey, you're a strength coach on staff. You work at the university. What do you do? What do you coach? And I said, well, no, I work in administration. And that, I mean, I almost get tired of having that conversation because that turns into a 15-minute explanation of what I do. But it's one of those things, and I think this is common with microaggressions. We very much normalize them and swallow these experiences because you just get tired of correcting or challenging people, and it just beats you up over time. And I think that's one of the hardest parts about what we're talking about. It's not the one incident that happens once and then it never happens again. It's the constant barrage of instances, and you never want to come off as the angry Black person or the person that's complaining about every situation. So again, microaggressions are not black and white. This is an incredibly tough subject, and I really appreciate you bringing us together to talk about it.
Well, thanks, Bryan. You know, Daryl, Dr. Sue describes it as a death by 1,000 cuts because it is ongoing, and we'll talk a little bit more in regards to when there's just constant bombarding and at what point do you address it versus just letting it go. So Irma, my Latina sister, you know, you were the country's first Latina athletic director in the Division I space. Woo-hoo! And so before that, you were a coach also, basketball coach, and you played the sport. So I know there had to be some stereotypes and some microaggressions in regards to Latinas.
Sure.
Yeah, exactly. Because
I want to let people know that first of all, when China calls, you listen, and China needs you, you show up. So that's a given. But because microaggression, the way we're brought up, we just don't realize that's a microaggression. Okay, so we continue to do it over and over again, or just let it go over and over again, just like what Bryan said. And I mean, I remember as a student athlete or a player, you know, I learned basketball in the streets, right? So I didn't learn organized basketball. So the first thing was that you play like a boy, you don't play like a girl, that's like one of the things. And you're Spanish, you don't really supposed to play basketball. You know, you're supposed to be like in the kitchen. You're supposed to be hanging out, doing things with your sister. You're the only one who's doing this. Why are you doing this? Why do you keep doing this? And as a coach, I remember clearly when, same thing as Bryan, you know, I walk into a gym and people would just automatically think that, you know, my male assistant was the head coach. And at first you think it's, yeah, you laugh at it, but after a while you're like, whoa, 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 wait a second. Because I mean, I'm just a young coach, 28 when I first started. What did I know? What was my voice? So microaggression to me is, it's really important. I myself am a learner at heart, and I'm learning more about it. You know, what does it mean to me? Because it's the insults, right? So you talk about microaggressions when you say something, but it's the insult when it feels like, that's not right. That didn't feel right. Or even when, as an AD, young AD, and I didn't know what to do. And thank God for my sisters in NACDA at the time, and very helpful. Vicky was there with me with the leadership. I mean, if it wasn't for that to tell us, you know, no, you have to be aggressive, but when you go and you ask, don't forget to ask people, you know, what you should be doing. And I remember clearly speaking to someone, a colleague, a male colleague, and they said, you know, you just got to act like a guy. Just be tough, get out there, do what the guys do. You're an AD now. That's what guys do, you know? And so those kind of words resonated with me now. Believe it or not, China, it's not even, I'm just feeling it now. It's so strange because I've been doing my homework about what is microaggression, what does it mean to me, and how do I check myself first before I can check anybody else? What do I have to do? And it's a twofold, right? What do I have to do to correct people to make myself feel better? But what do I have to do to make myself feel better to correct people? So those are things that, you know, and I'll be honest, when people keep saying you're the first Latina, Hispanic, whatever, you know, but, you know, for me, I consider myself Hispanic. I say, what does that mean? I was like, well, to me, you know, both parents are from Puerto Rico, and I consider myself a New Yorican. So that's how I handle it, right? But it's the fact that it's constantly asked, you know, and many of you, if you know me, you know I'm Hispanic. But if you don't know me, right, and you just meeting me for the first time, I don't look Spanish. I don't look like my sisters who have curly hair, who are dark skinned, or my dad who's very dark skinned. You know, I'm typically taken for a white Jewish woman because Irma, they also say Irma with an E is Jewish. Irma with an I, you don't say it that way. You're really supposed to say Irma, is Hispanic. So having to deal with those things and putting it in front of you and knowing that they are happening. And for us, you know, I'm taking this, I'm sitting with my colleagues here, listening to stories and starting a conversation because it needs to happen. We need to have this conversation. And it may get uncomfortable in a little bit. You know, you may ask a question where I might get a little uncomfortable. I know you will, China, but it's the fact that we need to do this, and we need to do this on a regular basis. So thank you. And thank you all who are on this, especially Bob, for allowing us to have this.
Wonderful. Thank you, Irma. It is so much to unpack, definitely. And that's why I keep saying we need more than an hour, but at least in these particular conversations, it will hopefully turn into more conversations on all of our campuses. You know, Joe, it's interesting because a lot of times when people think about microaggressions, they think only potentially ethnicity. Now, you can definitely talk about your particular experiences, but you do have a background in other divisions. And so microaggressions can be based upon whether it's geographic locations or being a Division 3 or Division 2. So feel free to kind of think about your experiences for microaggressions.
Yeah, thanks, China and Bob and NACDA and my colleagues on this panel for including me. Feel grateful to be here. You know, I go back to the Black Student Athlete Summit in January in Austin, and it was the first time I had attended the summit. You know, I guess about 11 months ago, and I remember one of the presenters said to the audience, and there were a handful of white people in the audience, she said something about, part of listening to presentations on critical race theory or on microaggressions is about learning how to sit with your discomfort and not sort of feel compelled to respond right away. And I really have kind of taken that to heart over the last 10 or 11 months. And when I think about microaggressions, I go back to that quite often, because I think that quite often, someone like me, white, male, Protestant, heterosexual, I'm of a very privileged lot, and I don't necessarily, when I hear that I've done something wrong, I tend to retreat to the intent. And what I've come to realize and learn from listening to other people is that that really focuses the feelings on me. How do I feel about this? Am I okay? As opposed to the person who is on the receiving end of the microaggression. And so I think one of the things that I've worked hard on and that I would encourage others to work hard on is the perception. Perception and intent ought to align. I think, as Bryan said earlier, it's not necessarily easy to square those things. But I can tell you that I threw a microaggression at colleagues last week, and was by someone that I have a good relationship with and trust. She brought it forward to me, and I'll be honest, I stole somebody else's idea and claimed it for my own. And I think we've created I'm hopeful that we're creating an environment here where I can hear those sorts of things, but I certainly didn't intend that, but that's not the point. The point is the perception was that one of my colleagues, who's a member of an underrepresented group on our campus, came up with a great idea. I didn't listen terribly well. 10 minutes later, I claimed that idea as my own, and I was called out on it. And I think that's a really good thing. And I think we need to be open with sitting with that level of discomfort and realizing that, if you're any part of the privileged demographic groups, that the perception of those on the receiving end of a microaggression is far more important than how you feel.
Oh, Joe, that's a lot to unpack, and I definitely appreciate you showing that vulnerability on that. And that's a whole nother conversation in terms of mansplaining and all these other things. So, but continue to speak on that. I'm going to jump to Bryan on this one. So, Bryan, there are 3 different terms under microaggressions that Dr. Sue had mentioned. You have your micro assaults. Those are the verbal, which are the name calling and the epithets that are being used. The nonverbal, which I have to admit, I'm pretty guilty of that. So that's the behavioral discrimination, such as crossing the street when you see a person that looks suspect, you go to the other side of the street. Or what I'm notorious for is locking my door in my car when I see someone getting close. And then everything from environmental, offensive signs and posters and other visual displays. How do you typically, when you're experiencing it, have you experienced any of those verbal, nonverbal, and environmental? And for an example, were you walking down the street and someone went to the other side? Share with us in regards to that.
Yeah, I probably experienced all 3 categories. I'd say, you may want to lock your door when I walk by. I just kind of rest in serious face that I've been told I don't smile enough, so I can see how that could be kind of intimidating. But I say that in jest. I think the hard part about microaggressions, and I believe this at my core, I don't believe there's any right way to respond. I think sometimes we look for terms of this is how you should respond to this situation, this is not. We had this conversation in our prep call. I think everything's context, and there's just some things that are not worth your time. And I firmly believe that. I can't be Superman for the entire world every time a fan makes a Facebook comment, somebody comments out of pocket. But if there are people I know or have an effect or impact on our student athletes, and I do feel it's my responsibility to have that conversation with that person, either in that moment or maybe after the moment. I mean, I know I've fallen into the trap of being the person that did the microaggression. And in that moment, somebody didn't call me out on it, but they followed up with me after the fact and said, hey, this made me uncomfortable. This is why it made me uncomfortable. And to Joe's point, you have to get comfortable with that uncomfortable experience of being corrected and checked in that moment. But I hope I got better from that, and I'll never do what I did in that moment or say what I said in that moment again. But I think so often we talk about allyship these last couple months, and everybody, how you should be an ally, how you should be anti-racist. But I also think we need to be mindful, because sometimes you can check that person in that moment in front of the person that was maybe the microaggression was directed at, and make that person uncomfortable too. So I think everything involves context. I think so much of this is about education and empathy in the context of microaggressions. My core philosophy is if people knew better, they would do better. So I think that education is a big piece of that. And then the empathy piece. I think so often people say, well, I don't see color, or you're just playing the race card X, Y, and Z. And you're telling that to somebody that's had those experiences and you have not. I think that's a problem. I think you've got to find a way, even if you've never experienced those shoes, to try to put yourself in them as much as possible.
Well, I appreciate you mentioning some of those solutions, which eventually we will get to that. But I do appreciate that. So this next question is more for Irma and for Vicky. So we talked about the micro assaults. Now there are micro insults, and this is all about intelligence, whether you're put to be smarter or put to be not as smart, criminality, issues of criminality, assumptions of issues of uneducation or LGBTQ, or people of color are most likely to do certain things, they're not trustworthy or whatever. So what are your thoughts in regards to those micro insults? Who wants to go? You want to go, Irma?
I'll let Vicky go first, because she's hit the, but I'm gonna stay on, Vicky. I'll talk back and forth with you.
I've learned that I've been mispronouncing your name for all the years that we've known each other. So, it's the one thing that, when you get older, is that you kind of be creative or get used to these microaggressions. And I always try to say to myself, they're coming from a good place. It's not intent to harm, but when you're receiving it, it really bugs you. But now, as we get older, Bryan, Irma, it will be, you get more creative, because everyone thinks I'm related to any famous Asian person out there. So they're like, are you related to Pat Chun? Yes. I'm like, yes. Sometimes they'll, are you Amy Huchthausen? Absolutely. Right. But, are you related to the North Korean dictator? No. There's no association. And, it's one of those things where you start to take it in stride. But, we're not perfect either. I do microaggressions all the time, and also well-meaning. I remember Keith Gill at the NCA and Dan Bogan, and Keith was a director level. Dan Bogan was the number 2 at the NCAA. And I was talking to Keith. I go, Keith, you'd be a great, Dan Bogan, moving up. And he's like, he called me right out. He's like, what about said? Why do you pick the one black guy that, the number 2? And I was like, you have a point. And I'll never forget it. This happened, gosh, over 15 years ago, but I'll never forget it. Because, we get caught up on that too. We don't mean to be aggressive or anything like that, but, from the receiving end, you do feel it. And
the one thing I know about Vicky is that she is funny. Her humor is, her one-liners, you got to expect that you ask a question, you got to expect something funny back. And so I appreciate that, right? So we do this on a regular basis. You know the person you're going to be talking to. It's the people that you don't know that you're going to be talking to, right? So as many, all 700, 800 people listening, they can pick up that I have a Brooklyn accent, and once in a while throw my Spanish in there. You can't tell what's why. And so my English is kind of broken anyways. It's just all over the place. So the thing that upsets me the most, and lately it's just been bothering me more than ever, is the fact that they may think I'm not smart. You know, you don't sound like someone that you should be talking to 800 people. You don't use the big words that other people use. And so I get caught up with that, you know, lately more so than ever. But now, on just like what Vicky's saying, right? On the other end, my mind, my judgment, my assumption of what some people are doing or what they do. So one of the things, and I will change it from now on, when a prospective, I meet every recruit. Since I have to sign the contracts, I want to know every recruit that's going to be coming to St. Francis. And so when I meet with the parents, and you know, people are scared of Brooklyn. People are petrified of Brooklyn. And they will cross the street. But then Irma also says that too, right? So I say, yeah, don't worry about it. If you see danger, you can walk across the street. You can't do that in New Jersey because there are no streets. You're stuck, right? And not knowing, right? That's the wrong thing to say. And I won't do that anymore. I won't say cross the street. I have to figure out what I have to say, but the pause, right? To think about what we're gonna say and the kindness that has to come out. And everybody knows I talk about kindness. That's in my heart. I work from my heart. I make decisions with my heart. And the kindness that we need to do moving forward, right? So I know we're jumping a little bit ahead, but it's so important to go back to what Vicky and I are talking about here, because we get it a lot, or I get it a lot. Vicky, you get it more than I do. And I apologize because my mom, I have to correct her all the time. She just automatically thinks everybody are Chinese, right? She just, in her mind, that's what she says, you know, oh, what, they're Chinos, that's what she calls them. I said, Ma, you can't say that, you can't. And you have to explain what Asians are and the different types. Now, mind you, that we have Laos, we have Japanese, and we have Chinese in our family, in our immediate family that married to my nieces and nephew. But to her, it's a constant battle. And that's what I challenge, not only myself, but all of us and on the panel, but everybody else, is really check yourself. You can't do anything. I'm gonna say that 100 times. You're really gonna have to do this personal check-in and work harder at what we want people to perceive us and what we want to perceive people.
Thank you, Irma. I really appreciate that. And
Chun, could I add on to that?
I'm sorry, Brian?
I don't want to cut you off, but could I add on to that comment?
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, I think Irma hit on something really big there. That self-check and the mental gymnastics you have to go through to decide whether you want to respond to something or want to confront something. I mean, that just weighs down on you over time. And I think sometimes we dismiss some of these things. You need to toughen up, or you need to develop thicker skin. But these things, that the fight that you do take on right then, or sometimes you don't, and it bothers you years. I can remember one circumstance where I got hit with a microaggression directed towards, it was in a conversation to me, but about a student athlete. And that was about, I mean, it was over 10 years ago almost, but it still bothers me to this day that I didn't check that person in that moment, because I feel like I let that student athlete down. I let my own race down. And these things just weigh on you over time. And if you confront it in the moment, you're going through this gymnastics of, will this affect my job? Will I come off as angry? How does this affect my future likelihood? Will I be able to raise money from this donor? If you don't, then you have that perception that maybe you didn't step up in the moment when you should. And I know if you want to be an AD, sometimes you have to figure out how to navigate these different spaces. And I try to be intelligent and smart about that. But this microaggression topic is just so hard. And I think the people on the receiving end go through a gymnastics and mental gymnastics, whether you do it or don't, and it can affect your self-confidence, which affects in long term the levels that you aspire to reach.
And once again, death by 1,000 cuts. You know, Joe, the third microaggression description is a micro invalidation. And so Bryan had touched on this earlier about I don't see color and things like that. And that is the denial of racial reality and dismissing the claims that there are some different experiences that ethnic minorities, people of color are going through. And that also includes denying or devaluing those experiences or those cultures. So that means it's ignoring the existence, histories, culture, groups of people, assuming that, everyone is the same. So what are your thoughts in regards to those micro invalidations? And as being a white male, you've been in many spaces that maybe many of us have not been privy to. And so how do you navigate through all of that?
Well, yeah, that's I think that's a constant form of microaggression that in conversations that I've had with colleagues that they face, that invalidation. And each of the panelists, I think, has touched a little bit on those aspects of the microaggression that that could be classified as invalidation. To me, I think one of the things that I've been challenged to do by my staff is to recognize that there is no monolithic experience associated with any demographic category, right? Everybody's a unique individual, and to try and approach and really listen and try to get to know people for who they are, and not expect that I worked with Bryan for a number of years, not to expect, and he even mentioned this in his recollection of the microaggression that he carries with him today. The sense that somehow he has to speak for all Black males in college athletics. I mean, that I can't imagine what that's like to carry that with you into work every day. I mean, there are so many things that colleagues of mine here at Rice carry with them every day that I don't have to think about. That brings me to, our senior staff has been doing kind of weekly DE&I conversations, and our topic this week, we went back and read the Kyle Korver piece from the Players Tribune that's maybe a year and a half old. One of the things he says is, as a white person, you have the option to opt in and opt out of these conversations and this space as you choose. And his teammates, I think with the Bucks at the time, did not have that option. And I think that's really the challenge that's in front of me and in front of my white male and white colleagues and privileged colleagues across college athletics, is we need to be opting into this conversation 24 hours a day. I think it's really important for us to move the industry forward. And it's vital that we not choose to opt out from time to time because our colleagues of color and our female colleagues and members of the LGBTQ community don't have that option every day.
Thanks, Joe. I really appreciate that. Let's dive a little bit deeper into how do you check someone? How do you correct someone? How, when, where, in what manner? I'll give you a situation that occurred to me. So I was speaking to a colleague at a football game, very informal environment. And the colleague said Oriental. And I just really had to watch myself. But because it was in an informal setting, thousands of people around, and I said, hey, we don't say that. We don't say that. And they're like, why? This is how I was always taught to talk. And, I'm just old. And I said, well, we don't do that anymore. We don't do that. And so I felt very comfortable with myself, especially in the state of Wyoming, to do that. But that may not be all the time in every type of environment. So Irma, at what point do you correct someone or bring to someone's attention that it is not appropriate? And what are times that you say, I got to let this one slide. This isn't worth the fight?
I don't let anything slide. And whether you don't say anything at that moment or you say something later, but you got to address it. And again, it's not addressing it where, you know, like yelling or being disrespectful, or especially to donors, but educating, right? So we don't say that, and I'm not comfortable. Most of the time I just say I'm not comfortable in the words that you use. And what do you mean? What are you trying to say? And then I try quickly to correct them. Well, why don't you try using these words instead? Because that's kind of not the way you should be addressing things. And please do. And everybody knows, anybody who knows me, my kids are the greatest, right? I love my kids. And if anyone ever said anything about any one of my kids, it's right away. But there's times where, you know, it's a big donor, right? Or somebody who, you know, that you're cultivating, and you're like saying, is it the money more worth, or being correct, or correcting somebody? And so I find ways that even, and I'll go home and sit with it, and I'm like, I have to, and I won't be able to sleep, but the next day I will make that phone call. Hey, listen, I should have said it then, and I'm sorry, I didn't address it, but this is how I feel. And if we're going to have this relationship, this professional relationship, I'd rather you don't speak about certain people or certain thing, or any of our student athletes, or any of our coaches, or any of our staff. So that's how I kind of navigate that. But, you know, Bryan brought up something where, you know, about doing it on a regular basis, right? Bryan, you were just saying that. And that's harder because I'm just doing it because out of my goodness of my heart, and because I'm just think that's the right thing. You're just saying that's the right thing. You shouldn't talk like that, right? But checking myself again and learning new ways how to deal with certain people, and what to say and when to say it. You know, now I'm learning more different ways. I'm educating myself. That's what Bryan said, educate yourself. I'm educating myself. Therefore, I'm leaving a bug in that person's ear, and they have to sit with it. Whether I change them completely or not, that's not what I try to do, but I want to keep that bug in that person's ear so they can see things differently and hesitate, pause, what we talked about, pause before the next time he or she says something that just didn't sit well with somebody else.
Wonderful. Joe, what about you? Has there ever been a time that you let it slide?
Yeah, we engage in these conversations frequently among our senior staff in exactly how do you address this? I mean, you know, on the one hand, you could see a situation where you may make the recipient of the microaggression more uncomfortable, or they may be expecting you to say something. They may be hoping that you don't say something. It's tough to know exactly what to do in those situations. I think, and I think they may all be different depending on the nature of the microaggression. I mean, we talk about the 1,000 cuts. I mean, the analogies that I've heard around microaggression, the stubbing of the toe, the paper cuts, you're never going to know if the recipient, if that's their 10th paper cut, 100th paper cut on that particular topic, 1,000th. You don't know how much it's been bottling up. You just don't know that experience. So, you know, for me, I think at a minimum, after the fact, if I recognize something, I'd want to get with that person and talk to them about it, talk about their feelings, and be an advocate and an ally for them, and be willing to go and address it after the fact, as Irma said, you know, just so that you put that bug in that person's ear. I thought that's a great way to think about it. You may not change that person's mind, but at least you'll get them to think about it. So China, I don't know that I think that there's a perfect way to do it. I think it's very contextual.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Vicky.
I just always, the microaggression, it's just a funny name, because when you experience it, when you're younger and you experience it, Bryan's right. Like someone asked me if I knew how to cook Chinese food when I was in college. It bugged me for a week that I didn't say anything, and that person is just, that's the conversation. But for me, I carried it for me for a week and I replayed it and I said, oh, I should have done this. I should have done that. As you get older, what I do is I try to correct with the language that I want to see, right? So I'm talking to what was an older person and he's saying like engines. And I respond by like Native American instead of just like calling it out. Or it depends on my relationship. If it's someone on my staff or anyone I know, I do want to have that conversation because I don't want them to accidentally insult someone without meaning. But if it's someone I don't know, I will try to correct with the language I want. Or if it's really, bad, then I will make the correction. Like I get called Connie all the time. I mean, there are some people, for Connie Chung, and I was hoping that it will kind of reduce itself because I don't think she does, ABC News anymore. She's now known as, Maury Povich's wife, but I get called that all the time. And I just said, no, it's Vicky. I used to let it go, but now I just make a quick correction and then move on. But it's taken years for it not to bother me as much. And it still does. So, that's how we work with it. We work with different people from different backgrounds. And again, I love it when people check me, call me out as well. And I think if we create a culture where people can be true to each other and it's not insulting, but we're just trying to help each other out. Like the more information, the better when you know that person. And so, I think this is a great time. We all are a part of a huge staff in athletics, and this is our opportunity to educate and have discussions like this. I think it's very helpful.
Wonderful, thank you. And Bryan, we're going to end with you on this question, and then we're going to start taking questions from the audience. But as you are answering the question in regards to how do you, correct someone, also answer, have you ever been in a situation where you had to correct your own boss? Maybe not your current boss that we know and love, but just any past supervisors, bosses, university presidents, those are in those higher authorities. So we'll end with you on this one.
Yeah, I mean, and I said this earlier, I don't believe there's a right way to respond to microaggressions. I just firmly don't. I think context matters. I think there's a lot of different situations. But as Vicky said, and I think she made an excellent point, as you get older and more mature, you become more comfortable addressing these type of situations. I feel like maybe when I was younger in my career and I got hit with something, it was like, wow, how do I respond? What just happened? Sometimes you don't even realize it happens until you start to walk away and like, what the hell just happened, And so I think Vicky's onto something because I'm way more comfortable right now having that conversation. I'm probably more like Irma, rather than, I'm not a screamer or yeller, but I am somebody, hopefully I've built a relationship with you. I can pull you aside and say, hey, I'm just uncomfortable with the way you address that or what you said right then. As far as correcting a boss or saying, I honestly hadn't been in that situation where I've had to correct the boss on the spot. I've been lucky to work for some really great ideas, ADs, one on the screen. But I will say, and I think Joe does as good a job of this as anybody in America, and I'm biased, right? But he creates a culture where he allows his staff to give really honest feedback and he makes himself really vulnerable. And that's really hard to do. I'm not sure, hopefully one day I get a chance to sit in that chair. I'm not sure I can do as good of a job as he does. And he did that before when I was at Rice. And that was, 2.5 years ago when I was there with him around the senior staff table. But since this social justice is kind of ramped up, I've seen that foundation that he laid for clear and transparent feedback kind of take flight and lay a foundation for these time of tough conversations. And I think that's really important for any leader, for the kind of culture you want to create in your organization, to establish those feedback loops and make yourself vulnerable and make sure people feel comfortable coming at you with that kind of information.
Wonderful. And I definitely agree with you. Joe has been just very open and engaging all across the board. And I think that the more that we're all open and engaging, the more that we can grow. We're going to go ahead and move on to some questions. So we have Katie, who is going to be reading questions for us. And then what I'll do is I'll just assign one of you guys to answer the questions. So Katie, what do you got?
Wonderful. Thank you, China, and thank you to all of the panelists. The insight that you had to share is very powerful and very much appreciated by all of us. We have a lot of really awesome questions. So let's dive in and try to get to as many as we can. The first question states, how do people know the correct terminology to use racially, ethnically, and so forth, when there is varying opinions within the culture of what the appropriate terminology should be? For example, some people prefer to be referred to as Black versus African American, Hispanic versus Latina, etc. Sometimes microaggression offense is not intentional, but is confused based on the information to go off of.
Wow, that is a lot to unpack. So let's go with Irma on this one.
Why did I know you were going to ask me?
Well, you already spoke on the Latina Hispanic, so
truth. And I remember speaking at a convention, and it had to do with minority coaches and administrators, and I think it was a combination of both. And I had mentioned African American women. I get a hand raised, and the woman said, I prefer you call us Black American. And it just stopped me. I didn't know what to do after that. I didn't know if I could continue. And I had to kind of, at that moment, what do I do? And so I apologized for offending her. And then I just turned to the crowd and I said, how many of you, I just made it into a question and asked the question, well, what would you want to be addressed as? And so the next time that I did another segment, I started with that question. Would you rather be called African American women or Black American women, or Black or brown? And that started the topic, right? So they started the conversation. I think that's what we have to do, right? So you don't know what you can and cannot call. Like, I mean, I don't get offended if someone calls me Latina. I find myself Latina. I find myself Hispanic. Some people just call me Rican. I'm fine with that. The fact is that we talk about starting conversations. What would you know, in a situation like, I would say, instead of saying where you from, so that person may feel uncomfortable, I may start with, you know, my parents are from Puerto Rico, and I'm from Brooklyn, and that's like a whole country in itself. And, you know, ease up. And I said, so are your parents from here, or where did you grow up? And so it just changes the way of making them feel like you're asking them because they look a certain way or they're acting a certain way. It just takes a little oomph out of it.
Wonderful. And you hit it on the head. Just ask.
Ask.
It's okay to ask. You know, I rather for people to ask than assume. So
absolutely.
What do you got, Katie?
The next question states, we have several student athletes that want to go into sport administration. How can we help prepare them for incidents like what each of you has shared, as well as help ourselves and them be part of the change needed?
Vicky, you want to take that?
Sure, absolutely. One is that if you are a minority, you will experience it. There's no avoiding it. And you too will also do it as well. And people will correct you. But what I think is programs like this are very key. So when you want to go into administration, yes, take advantage of every educational program, especially if it's free. But now this is something I think athletic directors will support as well. And I know during this time, we've all set up staff committees of diversity and inclusion. Some included positions, and some have staff committees, some have staff and student athlete committees on this, and let them roll with it, and have it be long-term instead of short-term. Like, we hope not to, for incidences to create energy on this. And, that's something that I think we could take advantage of, because quite frankly, that's how I learned as well. I took every diversity training, everything offered by athletic administration organizations. And I literally was brought up on that. I didn't come to this on my own. And so that is what I would recommend, is take advantage of all these opportunities so that you are prepared when you go in, because it will happen, and it'll happen both ways as well.
Wonderful. Thank you, Vicky. Katie?
So the next question states, could someone address the defensive reaction to being called out for a microaggression? For example, you politely correct someone and they say, I did not say that, or you are wrong, or you are too sensitive.
Ooh, Bryan, you want to tackle that one?
Yeah, I mean, and I've used this quote before. I don't demand perfection, but I do want to see progress. And I think for our athletic departments, for our leaders, for everybody, progress should be the goal, not perfection. Irma hit the nail on the head. Sometimes we talk about terms, and maybe there's a disagreement about what should be said or not said, and it almost paralyzes us from doing anything. Continue to do good work and lead in the right way, educate yourself, but the goal is progress, lifelong learning. We preach it in every other phase of what we do, but sometimes in this aspect, we don't talk about it enough. Got to continue lifelong learning. And there comes a certain point too. If somebody doesn't want to hear what you have to say, and they don't want to hear the conversation or have that conversation, then you just got to accept people for who they are. And that you may make a decision that that's not the kind of person you want to work with. I mean, the hope is that you create a culture within your athletic department, within your organization, that rejects that type of behavior and rejects that type of individual, because this is not a Bryan, a Joe, a Vicky, a Irma, a China problem to fix in America and intercollegiate athletics. Hopefully our entire department is on board with fixing these issues, and we reject those types of behaviors, those types of individuals.
Bravo, bravo. Joe, we're going to give you this next one.
Okay, so the next question states, if you are in an organization that has a leader who is not vulnerable by any means, how can you move toward creating an environment for feedback?
I think one of the best ways to sort of go about this is, most people would like to say that they're curious. I think that's a value that most people may not be curious, but they'd like to think that they are. They'd like to think that they want to know more about the world, about other people, about their profession, about their teams, etc. And I think that there may be a way to frame such resistance through the lens of curiosity, so that if you're finding resistance to somebody who doesn't see what they're doing, maybe a different way to reframe the discussion is, try to pique their curiosity about you and about your lived experiences and about your work within that organization. And that may help try to cut through some of this, because I know there's that initial resistance, but I think if you can learn to, we tell everybody in college athletics, Bryan mentioned this earlier, it's a cliche now. Oh, you got to get comfortable being uncomfortable. Well, yeah, that applies to all of us, right? That applies to leadership. It applies to all of our head coaches. It applies to athletics directors and senior administrators. And I think if you can embrace that discomfort and approach this through curiosity, you can, as Bryan would say, make some really good progress.
Well said, Joe. Thank you.
I'm gonna write that down. When we're gonna have to steal it or say, or put it like a little placket.
These are great nuggets, you guys, and I
There you
really
go.
appreciate all of your insight, your experiences, showing your vulnerability. This is great. I hope that these topics can continue on the campuses around the country so we can be able to continue to educate our student athletes and support each other. So that's it for us. So thank you to all. Bob?
Thanks, China. Great job. You're an awesome quarterback. Vicky, Irma, Bryan, Joe, thank you so much. You know, this is one of those sessions that we still have 17 questions that weren't answered. So I think we're going to have to do this again. We'll find a way sometime once we get into the new year. We'll find a way to do this again because, again, to Bryan's point, I feel like we're making progress. We're nowhere near there yet, but we're getting close. We're making progress, and that's the name of the game. So again, thank you for your knowledge. Thank you for your leadership on this very important issue. And to all of you and all in the audience, have a wonderful holiday season. Thank you very much, and stay safe out there. Goodbye.